The safe was already old when Grandma bought it. Heavy, black, and ugly in a way that made people stop asking questions. It sat in the corner of her bedroom for as long as anyone could remember, always locked, always silent. As kids, we were told it held important papers, the kind of answer adults give when the truth feels inconvenient. As adults, we stopped noticing it altogether. It became part of the room, like the cracked window frame or the crooked family photo above her bed. No one imagined that the safe would matter more after Grandma died than it ever had while she was alive. Grandma passed away quietly in her sleep, the way she had always lived, without noise, without warning. The house filled with relatives, casseroles, and murmured condolences, but beneath all of it was a strange tension. People grieved, yes, but they also watched each other closely. There was an unspoken awareness that Grandma had lived a long life filled with things she never explained. The safe became the center of that awareness. It stood there, untouched, as if waiting. No one opened it immediately. It felt wrong, almost disrespectful, like reading someone's diary out loud. But grief has a way of turning curiosity into necessity. 2 days after the funeral, we gathered in Grandma's room, the air heavy with dust and old perfume. Someone asked where the key was. Someone else said Grandma never used a key, she used a combination. And suddenly, the room fell quiet. No one knew the numbers. That's when the argument started. Everyone had a theory. Some said it would be birth certificates and insurance papers. Others whispered about money, cash Grandma never trusted banks with. One cousin joked that it probably held nothing but junk, a lifetime of receipts and expired warranties. No one laughed, because deep down we all knew Grandma didn't keep things without reason. We tried everything. Birthdays, anniversaries, addresses, even the date Grandpa died. The safe didn't budge. Each failed attempt made the silence heavier. It began to feel as though Grandma herself was still guarding it, testing our patience one last time. Hours passed. Tempers rose. Then my mother noticed something small but unsettling. The safe wasn't dusty on top. Someone had been opening it recently. That realization changed the room. Grandma had been sick for months, barely strong enough to climb the stairs, yet she had still been using the safe. Whatever was inside mattered enough for her to check it even when her body was failing. That's when guilt crept in. We had lived our lives assuming Grandma was simple, predictable, harmless. But the safe suggested otherwise. It suggested a private world we had never been invited into. Late that night, after everyone else left, I stayed behind. The house felt different without voices, like it was holding its breath. I sat on the edge of Grandma's bed, staring at the safe, wondering what kind of secrets survive a lifetime and only demand attention after death. I noticed a folded piece of paper taped discreetly behind the nightstand. It wasn't hidden well, almost as if Grandma wanted it found, but only by someone patient enough to look. Written in her careful handwriting were 6 numbers. Below them, a sentence that made my stomach tighten. If you're opening this, please be kind. My hands shook as I turned the dial. The safe clicked open with a sound far louder than it should have been in that quiet house. Inside wasn't money, not jewelry, not documents. It was something far heavier than that, proof of choices made, lives altered, and a truth that would force every one of us to question who Grandma really was. And that was only the beginning. The first thing I noticed was how carefully everything inside the safe was arranged. Not stacked, not crammed, but placed with intention, as if Grandma had packed it slowly over many years, always knowing exactly where each item belonged. There were folders tied with fading ribbon, envelopes labeled in her neat handwriting, and at the very bottom, a small velvet pouch that looked far too personal to be shared. I didn't touch that yet. I started with the papers because that felt safer, less emotional. I was wrong. The top folder held photographs. Old ones. Black and white, curled at the edges, the kind that smell faintly of dust and time. In the first few pictures, Grandma was young, far younger than any version of her I remembered, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. They were close in the way sisters are close, arms linked, heads tilted together. On the back of one photo, Grandma had written a single name and a date. The date didn't match any family story I knew. It came from a period Grandma never talked about, years before she met Grandpa. As I kept flipping through, the woman appeared again and again. In kitchens, on front steps, holding babies that were definitely not Grandma's, yet Grandma's expression in those photos was unmistakable. It wasn't polite affection. It was love. The kind that doesn't ask permission or explain itself. By the time I reached the last photo, my chest felt tight. The woman was gone, replaced by a small boy standing alone beside Grandma, his hand wrapped tightly around hers. On the back, Grandma had written, "The day everything changed." I moved on to the envelopes. Each one was dated, spanning decades, some recent, some painfully old. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Not sent letters. Kept letters. Written to someone named E. At first, I assumed E stood for Grandpa, until the words made that impossible. These letters were confessions, apologies, promises. Grandma wrote about choices she couldn't undo, about stepping in when no one else would, about loving someone from a distance because loving them up close would destroy too many lives. One letter stood out, the paper worn thin from being folded and unfolded too many times. Grandma described a night when a child arrived at her door in the rain, carrying nothing but a small bag and a name he barely understood. She wrote about signing papers that weren't meant for her, about agreeing to raise him as family, but never as mine. My heart pounded. I thought of all the cousins, all the branches of our family tree, and realized there was a limb we had never seen. The deeper I went, the worse it became. There were school reports, medical forms, even legal documents, some signed by Grandma, others by people whose names I didn't recognize. Everything pointed to one truth. Grandma had been responsible for a life that the rest of us never knew existed. Not secretly, but deliberately. She had hidden it in plain sight by never speaking of it at all. Then I reached the velvet pouch. Inside was a ring. Simple. Gold, worn thin. I recognized it instantly, because Grandma used to wear it on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her clothes. She once told me it was just something old. Now I knew better. Beneath the ring was a small card, yellowed with age, written in a handwriting that wasn't Grandma's. It said only, "Thank you for giving him a life when I couldn't." I sat back on the floor, overwhelmed, my mind racing to connect fragments that refused to settle into a single story. Grandma hadn't just kept secrets. She had carried responsibility that didn't belong to her, love that had nowhere safe to go, and consequences that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Footsteps creaked in the hallway behind me. I turned, heart hammering, realizing I wasn't alone anymore, and that whatever was inside the safe was about to change all of our lives, whether Grandma was there to explain it or not. My mother stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes fixed not on me but on the open safe behind me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. I didn't know how to begin, so I didn't. I just shifted aside and let her see. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, like someone approaching an animal she wasn't sure was friendly. When she picked up the photographs, her hands started to shake. She recognized Grandma in them, of course, but the rest was unfamiliar territory, and that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She sat down beside me and began reading the letters in silence. Minutes passed. Then more. I watched her expression change, confusion hardening into disbelief, disbelief melting into something closer to grief. Finally, she asked a question that cut straight through the room. Why didn't she tell us? It wasn't angry. It was wounded. I didn't have an answer. None of the letters explained why Grandma had chosen silence over honesty, only that she believed silence was the least damaging option. As we read together, the timeline slowly emerged. The woman in the photos was Grandma's closest friend, someone she had loved like family long before any of us existed. When that woman became ill, very ill, she made a decision that reshaped all of their lives. The child had a father who disappeared early, a mother who knew she was dying, and no one else willing to take him in without conditions. Grandma stepped forward quietly, signing agreements that kept her name out of official records, ensuring the boy would be raised nearby, but never publicly claimed. She became a guardian without recognition, a parent without the right to be called one. What shocked my mother the most wasn't the sacrifice itself, it was how long it lasted. Decades. Grandma had paid for education, medical care, even housing at times, all while pretending the boy was nothing more than someone she helped. The letters revealed how carefully she maintained distance, visiting under excuses, watching from afar, never crossing lines that could expose the truth. It wasn't fear that kept her silent. It was protection. She believed the truth would complicate the child's life in ways love alone couldn't fix. There was one letter neither of us could ignore. It was dated only a few months before Grandma's death. In it, she wrote about feeling tired in a way sleep couldn't cure. She mentioned the safe specifically, saying it was time the family knew, even if they never fully understood. She apologized in advance for the pain the discovery might cause, writing that secrets don't disappear when people die, they just wait for someone else to carry them. That sentence stayed with me, heavy and unavoidable. When other relatives arrived later that day, we told them everything. There was no gentle way to do it. The reactions varied: anger, denial, quiet tears, but none of them were prepared for what came next. One of the legal documents in the safe listed a current address and a name that didn't belong to anyone we knew.
It was the boy.
A man now, still alive, still close enough that Grandma had been watching over him until the end. The question shifted from what did Grandma do to what do we do now? Some wanted to leave it alone, arguing that Grandma's death should close the chapter. Others felt an obligation to finish what she started. In the middle of it all, I felt something I hadn't expected, a pull. As if by opening the safe, we had inherited more than knowledge. We had inherited responsibility. That evening, after everyone left, I copied the address onto a scrap of paper. I didn't know what I would say, or whether I would even be welcomed. I only knew that Grandma hadn't kept this secret to bury it forever. She had kept it safe until someone was ready to open it. And whether I liked it or not, that someone was me. The next morning, I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my coat, the letters folded carefully in my pocket, and left the house before anyone else stirred. The address led me through streets I barely recognized, quiet suburbs blending into older neighborhoods, until I finally arrived at a modest home with a small garden. The mailbox held no surprises, but the air felt thick, charged, as if the house itself knew what was coming. I stood for a moment, staring at the front door, wondering how to introduce myself to someone whose entire life had been shaped by Grandma's silent sacrifices. I knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, and there he was, a man in his late 20s, cautious, alert, and clearly not expecting visitors. When I spoke his name, his eyes widened, suspicion and recognition colliding in a single moment. I explained gently, carefully, who I was and why I had come, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on my shoulders. I told him about Grandma, about the safe, about the letters and photographs, about the love and responsibility she had carried in secret all these years. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His gaze moved from me to the letters, then back again, reading the truth in my eyes before he read it on paper. The tension in his shoulders softened slightly, but his expression remained guarded. Then he spoke, quietly, almost in disbelief, saying only, "She did all of this for me?" I nodded. "Every Sunday," I whispered, "for decades."
He invited me in.
We sat together at a small table in the kitchen, the letters spread between us like a bridge connecting the past to the present. He shared fragments of his own life, the struggles he never understood, the kindnesses from strangers he assumed were coincidence, the small interventions that had guided him without explanation. Every detail aligned perfectly with Grandma's letters, every quiet act of care now illuminated in the harsh light of understanding. The truth was more than shocking, it was transformative. By the end of the afternoon, he had begun to cry, not with anger or regret, but with relief and recognition. We spoke of Grandma, of her courage, of the silent sacrifices that had preserved his life, and of the lessons hidden in her quiet strength. I realized then that the safe had been more than a repository for documents. It had been a container for love, responsibility, and the weight of choices made in the shadows. When I finally left, the sky had darkened to a soft gray, and I felt the unmistakable imprint of Grandma's presence in the air around me. She had left this world, but in opening the safe, in revealing the truth, she had ensured her legacy endured. Her story would no longer be hidden. It would live on in the lives she touched, quietly and profoundly, reminding us that sometimes the greatest love is the one carried silently, kept in trust, and revealed only when the time is right. And as I walked back to my own home, I understood why she had chosen the safe, why she had waited until death, and why her life had always seemed ordinary to us. Nothing about Grandma had ever been ordinary. Everything she did was extraordinary, and now, finally, we all knew it.